My mum every summer always looked forward to having a holiday with her grandparents, and they lived in the mountains in a place called Reichenau an der Rax. And it was, I think the Baron lived there, so it was quite a place that people used to go on holiday. And my mum liked it so much because where she lived in Leopoldsdorf in Machveld in Lower Austria was flat. If you think Holland is flat, that's even flatter. There's no mountain, and my mum used to dream that it'd be nice if the Rax could come to Leopoldsdorf. Somehow could be moved, and then she'd realise later that that wasn't possible. So this particular summer, which was 1938, she went as usual to her grandparents, and then at the end of the holiday, her mother, my grandmother, would normally come and fetch her. It would give my grandmother some time with her parents. But this time the whole family came. So that was my mum's father and Dorothy, her sister. And she was so surprised and very excited. And then her parents said, "We're moving to England for a short time." Didn't say any more. And suddenly they were leaving, and they had a dog. It was a Russian style terrier, and my grandparents agreed to take Rexy, that was his name, although they didn't like dogs, but they did it for the love of their granddaughter. So it was very sad to leave the dog. So they left, and they'd been sponsored by an uncle, my grandfather's uncle, who'd come to Britain probably in about 1905. Didn't know much about him. So they managed to, if you were sponsored, they would allow you to leave. And it was just after Kristallnacht, and also prior to that, Dollfuss, the Chancellor, had been assassinated. So things were changing rapidly in Austria. And when they reached the border, Linz, leaving Austria, which incidentally was where Hitler was born, everybody had to leave the train, and they were all very frightened that they wouldn't be able to leave. And they were treated very badly by some of the German soldiers, spoken to harshly, and they had to open their suitcases on the station platform. And the soldiers stamped on the suitcases, threw the clothes on the platform, and then they were allowed to leave, but they were all very frightened. And then they came to Cardiff. They were met by my uncle, my great-great-uncle, who had a house in Ruthin Gardens, which is near St Gennydd Road, where the Sherman Theatre is in Cardiff. And they had one room, so the four of them were in one room. My great-great-uncle had 2 children at home, but he had 2 other children as well. He got my grandfather a job because he had a clothing business, second-hand, well, clothing and furniture. So my grandfather used to cycle up to Porth from Robina. And then once he was in Porth, if anybody had wanted furniture, he used to have to take it on his bike to wherever, wherever it was going to be delivered. Because my grandfather was always a worker. He would take any job he could. And when he'd been in Austria, he'd been a bookkeeper, worked in a shop, worked a bit in the farm, because there was a sugar beet farm there. So the person that owned it, Leopold Berger, owned the farm, or part of the farm. So, but he didn't pay my grandfather in money. He paid it in kind. So, which meant that my grandmother always had to do the shopping at the shop. So it was like a credit note. So, money was very tight. And where they lived in Leopoldsdorf, they lived in an apartment in the Lagerplatz, which is like a warehouse where goods come in from the train. So there was no running water, nowhere to hang up washing, no electricity. So it was very tough. So when they all came to Cardiff, they stayed from October to January in Ruthin Gardens. And then my mum went to the school in Colham Road. And then they were helped by Mr. Wilshire from the Plymouth Brethren, who helped them get a flat, which was in Robina, funnily enough, where my mum came to live in 1954. And they lived, it was above Thomas and Evans in Lonbach in Robina, that at the time was a small supermarket, Thomas and Evans, who I think were based in Porth. And then my mum went to Whitchurch School. She was very happy. The people were very welcoming. And they lived there until March 1940, when there was a knock on the door. And a policeman was there to say that they were going to be interned, which they didn't know what that meant. And then they were taken to the Isle of Man, to Port St Mary, where they were for 9 months. And then they were released in 1941. But they couldn't come back to Robina because it was too near the sea. So that's where they ended up in Leeds, because Leeds is nowhere near the sea.